Hey guys, welcome to book review, I believe number 90. Tonight I will be reviewing War of Frontier and Empire, the Philippine-American War, 1899 to 1902. Well, to start with, as the title would imply, this is a historical book more than a travel book that basically took a broad look at the Filipino-American War of 1899 to 1902. Kind of the predecessor or the lead up to this war was the Philippines was a Spanish colony for 200 years. Now, if you know anything about the Spanish Empire, they were at their height in the 15 and 1600s and actually lost most of their territory by the early 1800s. A few of the territories that hung on, colonies that hung on as clingers were Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. And the Philippines is ultimately what this book is about. But in sort of the classic American way, okay, so the Spanish were weak, I guess is basically what I'm saying, is that they were certainly not at the height of their empire. Their military was weak, their economy at home was weak, there was almost a coup d'etat in the country. Now let's take a look at the American side. The Americans had not been in a war since the Civil War of the 1860s, and were largely peaceful. I shouldn't say peaceful. There was huge domestic unrest, but they were not engaging in war with other countries for a pretty extended period. Now, much like the way that America engages in war across the board from Iraq to any other war, it's largely not about kind of animosity with another country that leads to it, like the classic sort of the way World War I would start, for example, where there was animosity between the kings that led to, or the monarchies of various countries that led to World War I. Rather, the United States tends to go to war by building up its military first for kind of unjustified reasons, a lot of it having to do with patriotism, a lot of it having to do with just, well, we're not at war, but we need something to do, so we'll build up our military, in which case the kind of cart, or the horse follows the cart, and they eventually go to war. So the Philippine-American War didn't start until after the Cuba, or I should say Spanish-American War in Cuba. Now, what happened here is Spain, well, there wasn't a whole lot to say really in the book. I'm kind of sticking to the main part of the book. They really didn't talk about Cuba a lot. The main thing is that's when Theodore Roosevelt had his big charge. The Americans got a taste for Spanish colony. I should also say that the Manifest Destiny kind of inherent in the United States in the West. So the West was kind of like the colony of the United States, if you will. People that were kind of unruly or not easily settled in the East tend to move to the Wild West and sow their oats out there, if you will. But by the late 1800s, the West had largely been settled. Now, not to the point where there was nothing going on, but to the point where civilization had largely come in, albeit there were still some Indian wars, but it was clear that the United States was starting to fill in the intermediate territory. So where did the United States look next? Well, they looked internationally. They looked to Cuba, and eventually, which they quickly defeated the Spanish, and eventually they looked to the Philippines. Now, the United States quickly defeated the Philippines, or quickly defeated the Spanish garrison in the Philippines after, and I should say specifically in Manila, after the Filipino Revolutionary Front, I believe that's what they're called, not 100% on that, took over basically the entire rest of the country. But then the United States at the last minute kind of swept in and took the capital, took the economic center, and there was a little bit of fighting, but not much, from the French. Well, actually, I should say there was almost no casualties on the American side. From the Spanish, armed forces there. And the way they really did it is they used their superior naval techniques. in that the Spanish had old warships that were made of wood, not reinforced with metal. The United States had advanced cannons that could fire way further than the Spanish cannons could, and basically just took like pot shots at the Spanish Armada from a distance in Manila Bay, and then quickly took over the city from there. The Spanish had largely given up or their last sort of pitched battle was the naval battle that was quickly overrun. So the United States now had Manila, and there was talk about maybe they would only control Manila and then have some sort of deal with the rest of the Philippines. But the United States, and its expansionist mindset, and its kind of what would later be accredited to Theodore Roosevelt, kind of the gung-ho mindset, eventually chose that they should, if benevolently, and I know all countries that think that they should have colonies think they're benevolent, even though they're not always, thought they should benevolently take all of the Philippines. And at this point, that mostly meant the island of Luzon, where the majority of the Filipino Revolution took place, the revolutionaries. Some of the other islands to the south were engaged in the Spanish, but had largely kind of operated autonomously, not as independent states, but just as kind of uncontrollable territories. So, at least for what was considered the nominal rule of the Philippines, meant taking all of Luzon. Now, militarily, how did the United States do this? Well, it really comes down to technique. The way that the Filipino Revolutionary Front was organized was, it mentioned in the book, like, this isn't just militarily, but this is kind of like across the board in the Philippines. Family first, village, and then country. So people thought of themselves as Filipinos last. They thought of their commanders second, and they thought of their families first. Now, obviously, this doesn't make for very good soldiers, because you need soldiers to be nationalists, to be hardcore and fight for your country. So what did the United States do? Well, it just took aggressive tactics, going straight at the enemy. Even in small charges, the Filipinos would fire a few shots in the retreat. Now, this isn't to say anything about the Filipino courage. It's just to say that organizationally, they had less concern for the idea of Filipino independence, though it was certainly on their mind. They wouldn't have volunteered or, in some cases, been drafted in if they hadn't thought so. But if someone was going to put up an intense fight, they were going to retreat to their family. Another thing that should be mentioned is Alizano, or, geez, I don't even know what his name is. The guy that led the main part of the Dewey was the one, I should say. Well, let's insert some names here. Roosevelt was actually not really involved that much with the Philippine-American War. Was not president at this point. It was McKinley. McKinley was against Arthur Jennings Bryan. Arthur Jennings Bryan being anti-imperialist. I'm just kind of filling in some random spots here. McKinley being sort of the more pro-imperialist. I believe he was Republican, maybe. And then Dewey was the head of the Navy that defeated that defeated the Spanish Armada, and was largely set aside for the Army once the Army took Manila, because then it was sort of about the island of Luzon, not some naval battle. The Filipino Revolutionary Front had no navy. They weren't a country. They only had guerrilla fighters and, stuff on the island of Luzon, mostly. Otis was the head of the Army. MacArthur was second in command. This being Arthur MacArthur, the father of Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur being famous for his exploits in the East, but no, this was the father, Arthur MacArthur, who kind of in a twist of fate, or the circle of life, took the Philippines, in which case Douglas later had to leave and reconquer when the Japanese came in. But that being a different story. So those were the main players. So what did the United States do? Well, in individual battles, they were just aggressive. Oh, and I was going to say, man, I forgot the name of the Filipino made person. Yeah, Emilio Aguin, Aguinaldo, Aguinaldo. I'll just call him Emilio because I can't pronounce that last name. He was the head of the army, but he did not have, because it was kind of, as I stated earlier, this kind of mishmash of groups. He didn't really have that much direct control over his military. So he would give an order. Sometimes it would take place, but sometimes when like a general, general or someone of a varying rank below him, which could be anyone, he was the head of the country or the Revolutionary Front, decide not to follow it, he could eventually punish them, but in the moment he couldn't. Like, he could punish them later, but there was really a fairly weak top-down chain of command. So not only did the individual soldiers have a chance to retreat, people at varying ranks through the order had a chance to not necessarily fight the American army. So the American army moved north. They were successful time after time, eventually pushing Emilio into the hills where he became a guerrilla fighter. And yeah, the guerrilla fighting was actually more successful than the pitched battles early in the war. The pitched battles were almost always American overwhelming victories. The guerrilla warfare, they could focus more on like the chain of supply. They could focus on like remote military bases that had like 20 American soldiers and therefore could be overrun fairly easily. The United States having a fairly significant army, but not enough that like they could just overwhelm the country and people. I mean, it's just like Vietnam, except their army was much smaller. So I guess no matter, to a degree, no matter how many people you put in, the native population is always going to have some advantage because they're the native population. They can kind of blend in, come out with the scenery or whatever. But ironically, Vietnam was lost, but the Philippines were won. This primarily being because, I'll get to that in a second. But they had Emilio on the run. And so they eventually caught him in an act of betrayal along the north coast where, a soldier betrayed his position. And then they had almost like a suicide run that actually worked with like 40, like what would now be considered like Navy SEALs or like, Special Forces, advanced military thing. Sort of like how they killed Bin Laden to a degree. But what happened after that? So they went into this raid pretending to be guerrilla fighters, and maybe like 40 Filipino soldiers that were fighting on the American side that had switched sides. And then the Americans were like pretending that they had been captured by these forces, by these quote-unquote guerrilla forces who were really fighting for the Americans. They brought him all the way into the building that Emilio Aguinaldo, whatever his name is, was in, and then said, "Surprise!" and quickly got him and ran out of the building. And because everyone was so disoriented, they really didn't know what to do. At which point, the United States, at a predetermined time, had set up a pickup route where they fought a quick firefight, but were able to get into the boats and take this guy into custody. At that point, it was pretty much just a mop-up job in the rest of the Philippines, though one of the biggest, it mentioned towards the end of the book, one of the biggest onslaughts was actually happened after Emilio had been captured. But unlike American consternation, which felt like this was a restarting of the war, it was really sort of the last gasps. And I mentioned Vietnam earlier, and I'll make this my last point. I think the biggest difference, just textually, between Vietnam and the Philippines was that, first of all, it was later in colonization. I feel like just the natural history of colonization in Far East Asia, now not in South America, because that had been largely, those countries have been independent for 100 years. The United States have been independent for 150 years. But specifically colonization in Asia, the time period was such just that a country was not going to declare its independence yet. Whereas by the 1960s and 70s, it was clear a revolution was a thing of the past, or a revolution. Colonies were a thing of the past, and a revolution was going to come, so a nation would no longer be a colony, though there would be independent. But secondly, really the idea of a modern Philippines is a new phenomenon. I feel like in Vietnam, as sort of diverse as the North and the South are, they see themselves as all Vietnamese. Whereas because the Philippines are broken into this huge island chain that has hundreds, if not thousands, of islands, a tribe on each island, and on many of the bigger islands like Luzon, which is where Manila is, multiples of tribes that were way more loyal to their clan and kind of looked out for their own selves more than other people. They really kind of were susceptible to divide and conquer, and the United States was able to take the territory that way. Of course, the Philippines remained a colony for about 50 years before getting independence after World War II, and now they're an independent country. So a lot of good the war did. So anyway, a lot of good the colony did. So anyway, a war of frontier and empire, the Philippine-American War, 1899 to 1902. Okay, keep checking out for more reviews, you guys. I'll see you later.